I like Sweden. It's a good country, but I regretfully have to say that there are many things that other countries do better than Sweden. In this video, I'm gonna list the top 10 things that the UK does better than Sweden. I'm on a trip to London right now, and I really like this city. There's almost as many people in London as in the entire country of Sweden, so it makes sense that there's a lot more to see here. I'm gonna do my best to suppress my patriotic Swedish feelings right now, because I'm gonna list 10 things that the UK does better than Sweden. Let's start with something slightly controversial. Let's start with British food. British food is universally marked as being among the worst in the world. You have strange dishes like jellied eels, mushy peas, black pudding, and toad in a hole. And the food is generally described as soggy, bland, overcooked, and visually unappealing. The thing is, you still see British food all over the world, but how many Swedish restaurants do you see abroad? Swedish food is quite possibly the very definition of bland. It's meat and potatoes, or fish, and very little spices are used. And sometimes it's not just bland, it's just plain disgusting, like fermented herring or this weird thing called Kalles caviar. The UK has pretty miserable food, but it's still better than the disaster that is Swedish cuisine. Sweden has some pretty strong positives when it comes to work culture. The work-life balance is excellent in Sweden. You have a lot of holidays and there's parental leave and people are encouraged to indulge in hobbies. Swedes are creative and nice to work with, and a flat work hierarchy makes people feel empowered. There's also excellent public transport to get to work, and overall Swedish offices feel like very good workplaces. But Swedish salaries are pitiful when compared to the UK. Sure, it's more expensive to live in a city like London, and there's a long commute if you live outside of the big cities. But the salaries in the UK are often twice of what you get in Sweden. I still think that I prefer working in Sweden, but I have to admit that the salaries in the UK are much better than in Sweden. I have to admit that I'm a bit of a geek, just a wee bit. As in, I'm a gigantic nerd and a dork. I've read a lot of fantasy and sci-fi books, and something that strikes me is how many amazing authors come from the UK. You have masters of the craft like Tolkien, Douglas Adams, Arthur C. Clarke, and Michael Moorcock. And you have slightly newer authors like Neil Gaiman, Susanna Clarke, Terry Pratchett, and I guess I can't avoid mentioning J.K. Rowling, despite some of her more questionable opinions. There are so many incredible authors from the UK, and that's before even mentioning any of the classics. I mean, I won't even have to mention people like Agatha Christie, the Bronte sisters, and Jane Austen, right? Meanwhile, what do we have in Sweden? We have crime novel authors, and that's about it. There's no way I could even begin to claim that Sweden can compete with the UK when it comes to amazing authors. Now, you may be wondering why I'm talking about this while walking around in a cemetery. That's because this is Highgate Cemetery, where you can see Douglas Adams' grave. I'm not much of a whiskey connoisseur, but I've had a few sips of single malt now and then. There's no place that can compete with Scotland when it comes to whiskey. Sweden does have a few whiskey distilleries like Mackmyra and High Coast, but I won't even pretend that the quality is comparable. Swedish whiskey tries to do something new. It's not an attempt to copy Scotch whiskey, and that's a positive thing. Innovation and experimentation is always a good thing, and I applaud Swedish distilleries for it. But as of now, the UK can keep its crown when it comes to whiskey, and maybe Sweden can become a contender in a few centuries or so, maybe with a bit of luck. I already mentioned that London is a pretty big place, and that goes for the UK in general. There's a lot of people here, and a lot of things to do. There's always a lot of events in London, musicals, concerts, parties, and a lot more. There's also cool pubs and bars and nightclubs and geek events and cool stores to check out. And the museums in London are top-notch. The city is full of culture and events in general. There is a bit of all of that in Sweden too, but there's so much more happening in London and the UK as a whole. Stockholm feels like a quiet little suburban town compared to the sprawling spectacle that is London and many other cities in the UK. There's just so much more to see and do in the UK. Sweden isn't exactly a stranger to cold weather. We have our fair share of ice and cold and snow every year, and we get by despite temperatures plummeting down to several dozens of minus degrees. But we get by dressing warmly. Swedish people have winter coats and long johns and layers of clothing in winter. Then you get to the UK and you start to question where the real Viking blood can be found. British people all dress in hoodies and stuff like that, even in winter. Sure, it's not exactly as cold as in Sweden right now, but I'm still putting on 3 layers of clothing. And you do see a lot of people with winter coats here, but all of those are tourists. I guarantee it. And let's not even talk about going to a club. Girls are dressing in skimpy clothing, even in winter. I'm not complaining about that part, mind you. I'm just thinking that the UK might handle cold weather better than Sweden. New York is called the city that never sleeps, but London is pretty insomniac as well. There's people out on the street at all times, and there's always a night open bar or an event happening or something similar. And stores are open late as well. If you need something here, you can probably find it any time of day. Now let's compare that with cities in Sweden. I won't even talk about the small towns. Nothing ever happens in those places. Let's talk about the cities instead. Gothenburg, Malmö and Stockholm are relatively big cities, but they're all so sleepy after night falls. You can go to a few nightclubs. Swedes like to get drunk after all, but that's about it. Everything closes down early in Sweden. Stores, events, everything. So I'll have to give the UK a big plus for having more accessible opening hours. Sweden is a very white country, and I'm not talking about all the snow during winter. The country is full of blonde and blue-eyed people. We've tried our best to invite people from all over the world, and that has led to more diversity. But it's all been going pretty horribly, so there's a lot of segregation as well now. Sweden is a very homogeneous country, and you often see people of the same skin color hanging out with people of the same kind. The UK is so much more diverse compared to that. Sure, there might be some sordid reasons for it from back in the olden days, but it's still so refreshing to see for someone from Scandinavia. I'm guessing that it's not exactly as multicultural out in the British countryside, but it's still better than white old Sweden. What's one of the most British things you can think of? I'm not talking about fish and chips or tea. I'm of course talking about pubs. British pub culture is famous worldwide, from the drunken merriment of London to quaint little pubs in random villages. The pub is a meeting place. It's a social gathering point where the young and the old can mingle. And they have beer as well, which is a very big plus, of course. There's lots of bars and pubs in Sweden as well. Gothenburg has a pretty decent pub culture, for example. And Stockholm has, well, places you can drink at least. But it's not really the same thing as a cozy English pub. The pub is a special place, and the culture that's grown around it is a very British thing. And it's definitely something we would like to have more of in Sweden, even though I have to admit that the pubs in Soho are just as crowded with random drunken tourists as any bar in Stockholm. Now, what's the top thing that the UK does better than Sweden? I've already covered a lot of good things, but there's one significant item remaining. It's not healthcare. Both countries are just pretty decent when it comes to that. Sports? Who cares about stuff like that anyway? Education? Yeah, come to think of it, that might have been something that I missed, but I had something completely different in mind. There's one thing that's almost the very definition of Britishness. I'm of course talking about humor. There's just so many amazing examples of British comedians and British comedy TV series, as well as the British dry humor in general. I assume that everyone in the UK has comedy in their school curriculum. Or maybe it's genetics. They have an extra funny bone or two. How else would you explain Rowan Atkinson, Bill Bailey, Dawn French, and all of Monty Python for that matter? And Ricky Gervais, Jimmy Carr, Rick Mayall, and so many others. Meanwhile, what does Sweden have? Robert Gustafsson? Who else? Johan Rheborg? Not Babben Larsson at least. I wanted to have some examples of people who are actually funny. I don't think that I can think of any other good Swedish comedians actually. So the UK wins by a landslide when it comes to comedy. And that was the final item in this list of things that the UK does better than Sweden. I hope you enjoyed this completely biased little list. Now it's time for me to find a pub and a pint, and for you to like and subscribe. But most importantly, have a great day. You could also have a look at this video next for even more possibly controversial topics.